friends. Welcome to In the Market with Janet Parshall. If you hang around this broadcast long enough, you know that we love history. And I'm particularly partial to American history, the great experiment where God has continued to shed his grace on us, which raises a whole panoply of Christians. Are we, in fact, a nation founded on Judeo-Christian principles? Are we a nation that because of the hand of providence, to quote the founders, we have seen ourselves blessed so far? Have we lost our godly moorings? And do we need to rediscover our American covenant? We've got lots to talk about, and we're all going to base it on a book that Mark Burrell has written, Raised in Pennsylvania. Kind of hard to ignore history up there. This is a man who helped do some church planting, studied systematic theology, began a teaching ministry covering a wide variety of topics, and then late in the 1990s, he became very interested in the biblical aspects of the founding of this nation. All of that is in his book now, Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restore America. Get ready for some insightful and historical conversation. Mark, I thank you so very, very much for joining us. And I just have to follow this journey of yours. Raised in the Episcopal Church, you came to faith in Christ as a teenager, went to Penn State, immersed in Pennsylvania, where so much of our history emanates from. But did you always have a love for history, or did you grow a love for history?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Janet. It's great to be with you. So I've always loved history. And I think that in my particular case, living so close to Philadelphia, you can imagine every year when we took a field trip, it was down to Philadelphia. It was for, I think one of them was the zoo, but all the rest were, Independence Hall, the Mint, all those wonderful things. So yeah, I just have always loved history. Also, when I was growing up, there was still a lot of World War II veterans. They were all around. And I was just enthralled, when they would talk about the stories from World War II. And in fact, I remember going to the Olympia, and there's a submarine down there too. At least it used to be. I'm not sure it's still there, just a little bit from Independence Hall. And the World War II vets would be manning their stations, and you could ask them questions about, their service. And I was just, mesmerized to hear their stories. So I loved history. I've always loved American history. And that was certainly a factor in writing this book.
So it's an arduous study, systematic theology. How did that prepare you, or how did it serve you as you began to dig into America's biblical foundings?
So the one thing it didn't mention about me is that I'm an engineer. I'm in my 40th year in the private sector in an engineering career. I'd like to tell people I'm a recovering engineer, because if you've been around an engineer for a long period of time, if you ask an engineer what time it is, we're liable to tell you how to build a clock. And sometimes we're not very helpful that way. But when it comes to a detailed situation or a topic, I think we can be helpful. And so in my particular case, systematic theology was exactly what I needed for my own faith journey to really take off, because I went through the Episcopal Church you mentioned, and we didn't learn much in the church. There was too much standing up, sitting down, reading from the prayer book. God help you if you weren't used to the rituals, and you might not stand when you should, and that whole thing. So I had a bunch of questions, and I was really fortunate to have a mentoring couple came into our lives in the late 80s. And within about 15 minutes, they actually moved in next door. Within about 15 minutes, we started talking about our faith. And I told him, I said, I have all these questions. And he said, you just need systematic theology. I'll take you through it. And so he gave me a book list. He said, start reading. And then that started about a 3-year period where he and I would meet for about 4 hours once a month. And we would just pour through notes, and he took me through systematic theology, and that gives you the framework to think about your faith. Not that you have all the answers, but at least you can talk about, for instance, if you're studying prophecy, you can say, well, here are the different positions: amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial, return of Christ, and you can have a conversation. So that was pivotal in my own personal faith journey. And when it came to this particular topic, the first question that I had was, if the revolution was all about taxation without representation. In other words, they didn't want to pay their taxes. But Jesus said you should pay your taxes. Then how could the whole revolution have been biblically justifiable?
Mm-hmm.
That was where I started my own journey in the early 90s. And around 2000, it dawned on me that, I should apply my training, my systematic theology training. So I read through the Bible, looking for any verse that had to do with liberty or justice or rights or nations. And Janet, I was flabbergasted at how much information I found when I was looking for it. And I started to lay it all out. And frankly, at that point in my Christian life, I had pretty much accepted the narrative that, hey, maybe it wasn't based on Christian values, and maybe the founders weren't, Christians. And so it took me 2 years to work my way back to, what, if I lay all the information out, it's pretty clear that these guys followed the biblical template for how to start a nation and how to govern justly. And so that's why I wrote the book. It wasn't because I woke up one day and said, I want to be an author. That wasn't it at all. I sort of was drug into this. And it took me 10 years, which tells you, to your point, how arduous a journey it was to try and, what is it you want to say? What's the story? And I realized that the story was about the American covenant.
Yes. Oh, it's a wonderful book. It's called Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restore America. So you can tell where Mark is going with this. When we come back, you brought up something, and I'm so glad you did, because one of my children actually attended a Christian school who likewise was taught that the American Revolution was, in fact, unbiblical. Then his mom and dad set him straight around the kitchen table. But I digress. The point is, that is an idea that's out there for some. You work through this vis-a-vis systematic theology. When we come back, I want to start with that, Mark. How can we look at it? If the idea was taxation, as you said, the Bible tells us to pay our taxes. Where's Romans 13 in this? Do we bow in authority to government as opposed to revolt against it? That's a great place to start our conversation. This is going to be a wonderful talk with Mark Burrell. Stick around. When your child leaves for college, they will face major attacks on their Christian worldview. That's why I've chosen Surviving Religion 101 as this month's truth tool. When the world challenges them, this book will teach them to remain strong and unashamed of the gospel. Ask for your copy of Surviving Religion 101 when you give a gift of any amount to In the Market. Call 877-JANET-58, that's 877-JANET-58, or go to inthemarketwithjanetparshall.org. We're visiting with recovering engineer Mark Burrell, who's also the author of Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restore America. So I want to go back to something that you went through personally, and I think it is a conversation worth reviewing right now. So let me just restate this again. If we are told in Scripture to pay our taxes, if the clarion cry of the Revolutionary War was no taxation without representation, how do we square the biblical directive to pay our taxes and to be obedient to government, Romans 13, with an American Revolution? How did you work that out, and what conclusion did you arrive at?
So the quick answer is that Romans 13 is actually an affirmation of what God ordained for civil government in the Old Testament in the ideal sense. And if you read Romans 13 carefully, it says that the authorities are in place for your good. I don't have the verse right in front of me, but it says to do good and to punish those who don't do good. And so if you read it carefully, what you're seeing is an affirmation that a just civil authority should punish those who are doing evil and commend those who do good. And so now if I step back, because I want to give you a more complete answer, because that's not the first place to ask, that's not the first question you should be asking. As Christians, we should start with this question: what is God's plan for the nations? And the answer for that is actually first given in Genesis 1:28, where he tells Adam and Eve to be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth. And in that passage, he says, subdue it. But then you move to after the flood. So Genesis 9, 1 through 7, basically he says, he repeats this. He says he wants nations to be fruitful, to increase in number, to fill the earth. And in this case, he says to govern justly. And this is critical, Janet, because, of course, right before the flood, there was no civil government. And what did we have? It was a disaster. God himself said that the heart of man was on evil all the time, and he decided to wipe the slate clean. And so the question we should be asking is, what would give us a reason to believe that things would be different after the flood? The answer to that question is that we are told that that we should instill justice. 5 and 6 are the verses where he says, I demand an accounting for the shedding of innocent blood. By human hands will that blood be shed. And so that is where God tells mankind going forward. This is all pre-Israel. He's telling mankind, I want a just civil authority. And at that point, you can say, well, I think I need more information. and so we get more information through the nation of Israel. And so this is theologically really interesting because recall the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. And he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'll give you a great land and bless the world through you. That's an unconditional covenant. But then when Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt, this was the point at which God officially started the nation of Israel. And he was doing that through Moses. And he followed basically a 4-step process. The 4-step process is, number one, you have to acknowledge God. And in this case, they were acknowledging God in the moral law because Moses came down with the moral law. You have to appeal to him for help. You have to commit to it. And then you have to declare it in whatever the custom of the culture is. And if you read roughly Exodus 19 through 24, you see that's what they did. And then if you just jump forward to the American founding, and if you look at the Declaration, you'll see that the founders followed that exact same covenant process. So we can come back to that. But that's the first question is, how is the government supposed to start? And what's the goal? The goal is to be fruitful and to govern justly. So then the second question to ask is, who does God expect to do this? That is the question that the modern evangelical church does not even ask. Is he expecting, for instance, people that don't know God to step up and govern justly? I don't think so. They're not reading the Bible. How could they know how to do it? Does he expect people who reject God to step forward and govern justly? Well, probably not, because they reject God. And they probably start with the rejection of his moral law. Well, how about new Christians? Does he expect new Christians to step forward? Well, that might be better than, the first two categories. But I think that it's really this fourth group, which is knowledgeable Christians who understand their Bible and understand the principles for establishing liberty and justice for all in the communities in which they live. He's expecting us to do it. There's really no other answer. So that addresses, that question of who should serve. So that's the second question. The third question is, what's the proper response for Christians living in a community under a just civil authority? And the answer is Romans 13 and 1 Timothy 2, submit and pray. You're supposed to submit and pray for your leaders. But then there's a fourth question, which is, what's the proper response when living under an unjust civil authority? And in that case, we know that we're supposed to confront and attempt to restore liberty and justice for all. That's what we're supposed to do. And again, we see this through examples in the Old and New Testament. And then there's the last question, which is the last chapter of the book, which is, what's the process to restore a wayward nation that's turned its back on God? And again, we look to Israel, and we see they did this many times in the Old Testament. They had a lot of bad leaders, but they had a couple of good ones, like Josiah and Nehemiah, for instance. And what did those two leaders do when they realized that they were sinning and that they wanted to recommit to God? They brought all the people together. They read the covenant aloud, and everyone recommitted. And then God blessed their reigns for a season, while they remained faithful. And so, Janet, there's a lot in that little explanation there, but the last question is the roadmap for restoring America. I believe we need to recommit to our national founding covenant, the Declaration of Independence.
So much.